Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today, Creating and Sustaining a High-Performance Board. My name's Sean McDonald, and I'll be your moderator for the next 40 to 45 minutes. Firstly, thanks so much for attending today. We really appreciate the effort you've made to be here. And during our session, if you do have any questions, we've got a large number of people attending today. I think it's over 200 attendees. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be answering these during our session. And we'll try to get through as many of these as we have time for. And finally, if you stay through till the end, which we hope you do, and as usual for our Board Pro webinars, we have a special treat for you. By answering our 1-minute survey at the end of the webinar, you'll go into our draw to win a beautiful gift hamper from our friends at Taken Care Of, worth over $400. Now, for those that don't know Board Pro, we are a board software provider that serve around 17,000 users around the world. We enable organizations to prepare for and run their board meetings more effectively, efficiently, with clever software, and with less time, and deliver more impact and value for their organization. And as much as we are a board software provider, part of our wider mission is to make the fundamentals of governance free and easy to implement for all organizations, especially those with resource constraints. Now, for the next 40 or so minutes, just relax, listen and add to the discussion by asking as many questions as you would like. The full recording of this webinar, along with the slide deck that we're using today and the topic white paper from Lisa Cook, will be sent to you at the conclusion of today's webinar. So without further ado, let me introduce our host and panelists for today. Lisa Cook is known to most of you, I think, as the founder and managing director of Get On Board Australia, supporting aspiring new and existing board members and boards to really thrive. She has 13 years experience serving on boards from a wide range of organizations in the private, public and not-for-profit sectors in Adelaide, Sydney and across wider Australia, including Shooting Australia, Inclusive Sports, West Beach Community, Bendigo Bank and Australia College of Professionals. That's a bit of a mouthful. Kia ora, Lisa.
Kia ora.
Chris Ridd, another person that should be known to all of you, is a non-executive director, advisor, and investor in various fast-growing Australasian startups. He's more than 30 years in the experience in the IT industry, including 5 years as managing director for Xero Australia and 15 years at Microsoft in various senior executive roles. Chris led Xero's expansion into the Australian market from a very, very small startup to become the largest online cloud accounting software, growing from 5 staff to over 3,500 staff, customers, I should say, not staff, to over 300 staff and 320 odd paying customers. So that was a huge achievement. Kia ora to you, Chris.
Thanks. And the grey hair to prove it.
And the grey hair, very good. Last but by no means least, Stephen Bowman, also well known to most people in the governance world, is the Managing Director of Conscious Governance and brings a great depth of experience facilitating board reviews and strategic planning processes. Stephen's held numerous senior executive, CEO and board positions in the United States and Australia, and as well as authoring and co-authoring around 14 books on governance, strategy, risk and executive leadership. Greetings to you, Stephen.
Thank you. Hello, everyone.
So for now, I shall hand over to the lovely Lisa Cook, who will take us through the webinar for the next 40 minutes. Over to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you everyone for being here today. I really appreciate you spending some time with us. Thank you for Chris and Steve as well for joining me on today's webinar, and they're going to thankfully and enjoyably breathe some life into the theory side of things that I'm going to share today. Let's move forward, Sean.
Thank you.
Thank you. So today we're going to be kind of tackling this challenge that we all seem to have if you've spent any time on boards before, which is around this high performance. How do we become a high performance board? And to me, high performance is an effective and efficient board. And I feel like it does start with answering this question: what does great look like for us? And once we've answered that question, then going on to look at the ways in which we can sort of create the environment to allow that greatness to happen. So
I might interject there. Sorry, Lisa. Just I totally agree what good looks like, and I know that you and I share a passion on some great authors, one of which is Patrick Lencioni, which he wrote a book entitled "The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team." So when I actually see that statement, and I think about if anyone's read that book, you actually think about that book is coming from the perspective of what actually bad looks like. And I think if I look over my experiences on a board, and it's only been literally probably years, there's a lot of observations, and I'm sure we've all seen what bad looks like. So I think that's another angle to take as well, because dysfunctional boards, unfortunately exist. We've all sort of been part of that. So if you're starting to look at the ideal situation, also think about what you don't want it to look like, which is bad.
Absolutely. That's certainly one way to approach it as well. What do we not want to be doing or ending up? So today is really just the beginning of an invitation to lift up and out of the busyness of the board work and really consider how the work of your board gets done. It's probably something we're not conscious of or thinking of, but there is method in your madness. So today we're sort of going to tackle those things. It's going to be very high level, just in the interest of time. For that reason, there's a lot more information that we share through that white paper. So I really encourage you after today's session to read through that and pick out some of those things that resonate with you, take it to your board, start having the conversation. You can then get even more support and insights and information if you reach out directly to any of us that are on this webinar today, to me, to Steve, to Chris. So that's an invitation there as well. Throughout the session today, there's going to be 2 pauses for questions. I really do encourage you to ask questions. It's how you get the best and the most value out of your time being spent here today. So I do encourage you to do that and ask them when those opportunities come up or as we work through, but we will be pausing twice for questions, so they are coming. And I do believe there may be, if we get enough questions, a separate Q&A that we can work through and share that with you either live or as a recording. Let's move forward, Sean. Okay, so let's start with where we're coming from here. High performance really does remain this elusive ideal for most of us. And why is that happening? We really wanted to sort of dig down into where is this coming from? Because I don't think we're all getting together with the intention of being dysfunctional or being ineffective or really making our lives hard for ourselves. I mean, sometimes it might feel like that's happening, but a lot of reasons why we end up not being high performing is from these things as well as others. So firstly, assuming that it's going to happen organically or naturally. And I feel like this is a trap that many of us fall into, which I feel like is a byproduct of how we generally approach our work in a professional capacity. So we have this sort of hyperactive hive mind approach, which is terminology from Cal Newport. And it's really just this frenetic, unscheduled approach to doing our work that we then translate into the board space. And chances are high that you're likely doing something else while you're listening and tuned in on today's webinar.
That's often shown, Lisa, through if you ask a question, how often do you hold board meetings? Oh, 11 times a year. Why? Well, because we always have.
Exactly.
And that's the end of the questioning. So, yeah, I think that's a really important point.
Yeah. And so this sort of comes with the the next one where there's this no intention, this lack of intention. And I don't think that's a conscious choice. It's just no one's ever stopped to think that we can stop to think about how we do things. As you said, Steve, it's just, well, this is the way we've always done it. We've always had 11 meetings a year. And so therefore we shall do that forever and ever and ever. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. On top of that, it's not changing with the times. Governance, how we do governance, not only on a sort of macro level, but micro within the organization is alive, it's evolving all the time. And how we do governance can change with the times. We can do it better. We can adopt technologies to make the work that we do that little bit more effective, that little bit more efficient. Beyond that, sometimes no direction, no leadership. And these things are not mutually exclusive. They can all be happening at once. And so if you have a captainless ship with no map to follow, that's what it might feel like sometimes dealing with your board. And much as we sort of move away from this kind of dictatorial mindset, and you don't want to go there, people will thrive in an environment where there is a strong, inclusive leader. And so someone has to take that role. Normally it's the chair. And so I encourage you, if you're the chair, to be the one that starts these kind of conversations.
And if I can just add to that, Lisa, too, I mean, true leadership is the board and the senior executive working really closely together with slightly different focuses. But often what you find is the us and them syndrome, where we're the board, we are the ultimate, we are everything, you're there just as minions, as as executives. But when those two groups work together seamlessly, it provides immense power that really drives the organization into the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that works with the next point around no rules of engagement, that you need to figure out how you're going to engage, not just the board within the board, but the board within the management team with the CEO or the equivalent person, and beyond that as well. You're exactly right. So have we come together and talked about how...
Just before we move on from that, Lisa, perhaps Sean, if you can just jump back. One of the things that really strikes me about some of the points there when you talk intention, no leadership engagement, quite often it comes down to self-awareness as a board. I think one of the really important things you've got to do, because let's face it, we attend board meetings as a sort of quite often it's a side gig. You know, we're doing it outside of a full-time role, and there is a tendency at times where you kind of drift into those board meetings. I think this is all about self-awareness and self-reflection as a board. You have to have conversations to discuss how you're operating as a team.
Yeah.
Take some sporting analogies. Sports teams do it all the time in terms of the different roles that are played to get the best out of everyone. And, you know, one example, I'm on a board where one of the board members, we are totally different thinking styles. And that's okay, because we're really conscious. We talk about the fact that this particular director turns up, we often disagree. And at the end of the board meeting, we'll reflect on that and actually say, that was really effective. I actually disagree with some of the stuff you're saying, but that is what good boards do. That self-awareness, that conflict, if well managed, is very, very healthy. But often we just sort of drift into these and don't actually think about some of these important dynamics that actually results in better outcomes as a board. So I think these are really good, important points just to be aware of.
Absolutely.
Well said.
Absolutely. So I also want to point out that you may not be coming to this webinar from a point of our board is dysfunctional, we need to fix it. You could also be here with the intention of wanting to make something that's good into something that's great. So whichever way you're coming from, we welcome you. This approach is going to help. It's not only going to fix dysfunction, but it's also going to help take you from good to great, to borrow from Jim Collins. So a great place to start, as Simon Sinek has taught us, is to start with why. Why are you here? What does great look like? What are you really trying to do? And there's no one right answer to this question. There's so many different factors that are influencing what great is going to look like and what is the role of your board? Why does it exist? they are coming from all different areas. And some of these influences include things like your governance and compliance requirements. Of course, we can't turn away from that. What is the organization looking at in relation to its operating environment and the strategy that it's chosen to adopt? And also things like the bench strength, who is within the board, who is within the management. So there's a range of different factors that are influencing on it. And much like, I always imagine this part of the process of becoming an effective board, much like what we do with an organization where we set our sort of vision statement or our mission. So why can't we have a similar one, or at least certainly one that's aligned for our board? It might sound a bit naff, but it's certainly going to give you a point in which to orientate to, so that everything else that we're going to talk about today is going to point you in that direction and take you on that journey, so that you're not just all coming in and floating around and going through the motions and not knowing if you're actually making a difference or not within the organization.
Lisa, one of the great touchstones for that, and this becomes very practical then, is either your vision or your purpose statement or your mission statement, whatever you call it, actually start to use it shamelessly in everything that you do. So you'd have it on your board agenda, and the directors are reminded to use that before they frame a question or before they ask a comment. And the reporting coming up to the board should answer that, well, how is this going to affect our vision or our purpose? And so that if you start to build that into your DNA, and I'd say unequivocally that over 80% of boards don't do this in the unlisted, the listed, the not-for-profit, all the sectors that we've got. But one of the best future casting tools that you've got is actually making use of your vision to help lead conversations regularly and shamelessly.
Yeah, well said, Steve. And I think one of the conversations that can lead is about then those 4 pillars that we're going to be looking at in today's session, around people, information architecture, structures and processes. And of course, one of the most powerful influences on the board's work is those group dynamics and the board culture. So, Sean, let's jump forward.
Right, we'll move from Q&A because I don't see anybody putting any questions in. So please don't be shy. Drop your questions in the Q&A box there so we can have some good old dialogue.
Yeah, as I said, that's how you guys can get the most value. You've got access to some really smart brains here today, so use it. It's free information.
Indeed.
So what we're going to do now is move into looking at each of these individual pillars. And this is a model that has been not even adapted. This is a model put forward from a person called Didier Cosson, who has a book around creating a high performance board. And he uses these pillars as elements to an effective board. So it's a great model for us to utilize for our conversation today, and for you to approach building your effective board in a methodical way. What are the things you need to look at and consider? I like to call these mechanisms of an effective and efficient board, but I don't actually see them as pillars, and we might set ourselves up for failure if we see them as standalone individual elements or mechanisms of an effective board. They're far more interdependent and interrelated than we may first think. So I would encourage you to keep that in mind as we work through that today. But I will use the terms of pillars and the language used out of respect of Didier's framework that he's developed. Moving forward. Okay, let's start with pillar 1, which is all about people, specifically around the quality, focus, and dedication. But I do want to start in the middle. I want to start with focus because I feel like that's our first stop on this journey. Once you've got that vision sort of statement, or even if you borrow from that of the organization, that's going to indicate to you, in amongst everything else that's influencing the organization now, what you need to be focusing on, what's mattering most to your board at this point in time. And don't think too far ahead. Sort of take a 1 to 3 year horizon is probably realistic to consider. So think about, what are your priority areas stemming from there? Where are we and where do we need to be investing our time and energy? There's again no right answer to this question, and it really does involve the board needing to consider, what does the organization, what does the bigger picture need from us at this point in time as a board? The second, so we jump back now to the first point here on the slides, is around quality. So once we know the focus, we kind of know that the types of people, the types of expertise, the types of competencies that are going to enable our board to focus on and get done what it needs to get done. So what we see a lot here is some work in your skills matrix or your skills map. What are your desired and required attributes of your board members? And not just considering their professional competencies as well, but also to consider some of the personal attributes and traits that are going to be of value on this board based on what you need to be doing and focusing on. Of course, don't forget your diversity attributes as well, and take a broad approach to diversity. Also, with quality, there's many attributes that are universal to all boards. I mean, we've got one here. We want board members with dedication, of course. So how can we integrate that? But what are some other attributes that are either universal or specific to our board that we really want to make sure that we have on our team? And then you can assess your board against that, see the gaps that need to be filled, or start having those conversations with those board members that probably aren't going to be suitable for this team going forward.
I like the dedication one, Lisa, because I think a couple of years ago I was looking at an investment in a tech company, and the guy who was pitching it was on the board, but he was on 10 other boards.
Yeah.
And I think this dedication one, it's very easy for people to sort of drift into directorship roles, but you do have a fiduciary duty. And my comment to him was that I didn't think he was able to actually exercise that adequately. Really capable guy. Yeah. But this dedication one is that everyone, we've all been there when you go to board meetings and there's one or two directors, or someone's not prepared. I've been to board meetings. I love boards where directors actually lean in and actually get into the detail, that attention to detail. So it's having the quality of time to be able to put into a board, and can't underestimate how important that is, because we have an obligation. So we've got to be able to exercise that.
Yeah, I agree. And overboarded board members is actually being written into some of the governance codes and recommendations and principles about not holding too many roles. And when you think about it in the context of dedication, we talk about gold medal board members, which is phraseology put forward from Russell Reynolds and Associates. And really, gold medal board members are those ones that go the extra mile. The data that Russell Reynolds Associates shared was that these gold medal board members actually spend up to 17 times more hours per hour of board meeting in their preparation. And if you're sitting on 10 boards, I don't know where you're finding that time for, but I thought that we all only had 24 hours in a day, but obviously they might have some more. But that is a consideration to take as well. And that may be one of the things that you use to assess the quality of your board members. How many boards are you sitting on? More is not more, fewer is probably better, because then you can get in deeper and do better work.
I think, Lisa, another element around the quality is, don't just rely on the quality they bring. Why don't we as a board actually improve and exponentialize that quality? training, experiences, all those sorts of things, because a director on one board may bring particular points of view to that board, but on another board may need more experience, more access to different things within the organisation. So not just left up to, they've got all this experience, they'll be good.
Yes.
Why is it that 70% of directors aren't?
Yeah, exactly. You raise a lot of good points.
I have 3 questions or comments actually that have come in. One from Melissa Hewitt. The way to look at it might be that after the 4 pillars support a roof, you like your organisation, and any pillar failing causes the roof to fail. Just a statement there. Another one from Katerina. In a very high and challenging environment, culture is a must, not only for the organisation, but also the board.
Absolutely.
And from Stephen Abbott, we've recently undertaken a skill assessment and board recruitment process. We're on the cusp of adding 4 new directors, which is a significant change. Any advice for how to best induct new board members, not only for them, but for the broader boardroom dynamics? Good question.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that one? 3 key things in your board induction. We won't go into detail here, but number 1 is make it mandatory. Number 2, make it over a 12-month period. And number 3, make sure you've got a really strong mentoring system in place and switch mentors every 6 months.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Said from the master himself.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's jump forward to pillar 2, which is around information architecture. And the board's outputs, when you think of it at the end of the day, it's really high quality decisions to do things, decisions not to do things. And really that relies on receiving the right information at the right time in the right format. And there's no strict definition of what right means. You as a board need to define those. And at the end of the day, sort of the yardstick is that information allows you to make high quality decisions.
Just to comment on that, I think also the ultimate test there is respect the reader. It's understanding the board's role and how to present information. I've got a real life example right now. I've actually been put into unexpectedly the role of interim CEO of a company where I'm sitting right now. I've got the first board meeting tomorrow. I was actually on the board. Now I'm in the role, so I'm sort of experiencing this firsthand. Unfortunately, with the CEO departed. Whole range of reasons, but the first 3 board meetings, newly formed board, the first 3 attempts at the board pack was not good, and so it forced me now as CEO to go back and look at what are we trying to say to the board, and it's been a really interesting experience, and I think it just comes down to that. It's really understanding that format issue is so critical, because quite often we receive board packs where I think Steve was talking about this another time. You had a good analogy for this. I'll let you talk about, but it can be really hard as a director, just trying to figure out what it is you're trying to say. And so having that ultimate test, I think, is really important, so that you can just cut to the chase.
And thanks for the segue there, Chris, because the analogy is very much, we see thousands of board packs and most of them suffer from the Where's Wally syndrome. We know there's something interesting in here somewhere, but of these 700 pages that I've got, I'm still not being able to find it. Yeah. So what we need to do is to bring out the Where's Wally right up front, so that if you've got a CEO's report, for example, you don't provide the whole CEO's report as part of the board pack. You pull out the things that the CEO wants the board to focus on, and then they can have a link to the actual CEO's report. And this goes for every single report. We did one just recently on Monday with the senior executive team and board. And their clinical governance reports were quite voluminous. And the person who was writing those reports, once we talked about you've got to answer the so what question. Don't just provide information. Information confuses. Mm-hmm. So what we've got to do is provide them with the so what and the Where's Wally bit of information they need to know. And she actually said, I never actually realized that I was writing for the board. I thought I was just writing a report.
Yeah, good point.
I've got a few comments that have come in here. I'll just read through them because they're short. Richard Thurlow said, can 6 board meetings a month mean that the boards begin to disengage? I would say yes, most definitely.
A month?
I don't agree.
You don't agree?
No.
Good Lord.
Because and the reason I say that, and this is why I love chatting with Chris, most boards never actually look to see how many board meetings they actually need to do their job, because they come from the space of, we've done it for this long, we need to do it for this long, because look at the size of the board pack. So my suggestion to all boards is to say, okay, if we were to meet every 2 months or every 3 months, what would we need to put in place so that we could have comfort that we could meet every 2 months or 3 months? Do that and still meet monthly. And once you've done that, you can then just say, actually, it doesn't make sense for us to meet this often, because we're getting the detail that we need. We're getting the conversations. We're having all these other things. Too often, boards see board meetings as the only way, the only mechanism for them to be a board member. There's many other ways that we can start looking at that, and having voluminous board reports and incredibly often board meetings is not the answer. In the US, they just did some research saying that how much does a board cost? And what they found was that staff, senior executives, are spending 30% of their time total developing up board papers.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, that's
I
insane.
think, that question there about 6 meetings a month, either they're managing through a crisis, or there's a complete lack of trust, dysfunction of the board, because they're not able to make decisions. But anyway, that's probably an extreme case. Keep going, Lisa.
Yeah.
The only caveat I would put on around how many meetings your board has to have is it's probably stipulated in your constitution. So make sure you're hitting that, or if it's too prohibitive, change your constitution to give yourself a little more leeway about bending and flexing how often the board meets. That's the only thing I would say here. As we know, too little or too much information can, both extremes can keep the board in the dark, can keep the board in trouble. Many of us are familiar with the Centro case, where the board missed a significant financial element of their business that was wrongly allocated. It got them into a lot of trouble. And that was because their board packs were too big, and they tried to use that as a defense, and it fell over.
And one of their staff got jailed because he amended the board minutes to make them reflect what he thought was a better story. And that's a no-no. You don't mess with the board minutes.
Yeah, big no-no. And that's a whole other conversation for another webinar. It's about your minutes. It could be. So your information architecture, in essence, it needs to consider and enable the points 2 and 3 on your screen here, the internal and external information sources, and the formal and informal channels. And these are reflected in that white paper, so I won't go into them right here and now for time reasons. But there's also this element where the board members need to do this self-directed information gathering. As Steve said, the way you're a board member is not just showing up to board meetings. There is all this other stuff that happens. Being a director is not a passive state that you're in. It's actually active. A great line that I love to remember all the time was put forward by Justice Pollock: a director is not an ornament. Okay, you are there to do a job. It inherently infers that you are active in that job, and self-directed information gathering is an element of that activity. So pillar 3, which is really closely related to your information architecture, is around your structures and processes. And these sit within that information architecture and is supportive of what you're trying to achieve at the end of the day, which is the right information at the right time in the right format that enables the board to make these high quality decisions. So this is around how you work. You're probably drilling down now into some of the nitty-gritty around your structures, which is things like your annual board calendar, your annual strategy session, what sort of positions you have on the board. So sometimes we have the chair, the vice chair, some have a treasurer, some have a secretary. There's all different variations. What committees you have, which ones, how many, how do they fit in with the bigger work that the board needs to do, and how regularly your board meets, as we've talked about, when, where, for how long, all of these things work into those structures. Using technology, tools like Board Pro really help you on that journey to create the right environment to do that good governance. And then things, wanted to jump in?
Oh, I was just I say that comment came up. I think it's Nirmal talked about the annual governance calendar, and I think these are all valid points. The more, I mean, as a director, you want to spend the vast majority of time thinking and problem solving and understanding the business and strategy and those sorts of things. And the more admin you can take out of it, I think an annual calendar certainly helps you, making sure that nothing slips through the cracks.
Yeah.
You don't want to get to the end of the year and think, oh, we didn't talk about information security, and then you've got a breach. Like, so, these are things that, you absolutely got to be on the ball. So the more you can be organized and set that structure up, the more you spend time on the things you should be.
Yeah. Yeah. It really smooths out that work. So we're not having to check 100 policy documents once a year. That makes sense.
Can I just mention too, Lisa, for everyone who's listening or watching this, Board Pro have white papers on just about all of those things that you talked about there. So if you want to see, it's probably one of the best libraries now in the world when it comes to information, which Board Pro have decided to structure because they want to help. And so just go through and have a look at their website and their resources there, because it's all there.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no lack of information in this space. Can say that. So also, if you want to consider what are the processes that sit within those structures. So you've already talked about how many board meetings you want. So how do we set our agenda within those board meetings to ensure that we're balancing those strategic versus tactical, that we're getting the work done, that oversight role that we play as well, and all of the things that we need to do. There's things like your process for CEO succession, board succession, your compliance processes, your strategy. How do you track your decisions? So how do you know that your decisions are high quality at the end of the day? You track how they've been implemented and what those outcomes were. So our last pillar is pillar 4. One of the most critical parts, when you ask anyone reflexively, they will point to board culture, they'll point to those group dynamics as having the most impact on the board effectiveness. At the end of the day, like I said here, we expect board members to show up to board meetings, but what we get are human beings. And people are people, and people will do people things regardless of how many structures and processes and rules and all of those things. So you need to consider that as well. You need to ensure the people on the board within the management team are supportive and engaged with those structures you're setting up, with those other 3 pillars. There's no point doing a whole ton of work around those and not engaging the other board members in that process, because they just won't have that ownership. They'll feel like it's imposed on them. It's probably not going to be the most effective because you haven't received that input from everyone around the board table. So think about that as well.
Lisa, can I say your point number 3 there, agreed upon values, behaviours and rules of engagement. When I reflect on the dysfunctional boards that I've had the pleasure of having to deal with over many years, that's the big one. That's the one that screws everything over. And often they don't have any agreement on values, or do they measure it? They might have a series of value statements, but that's just for the staff.
Yeah.
And they're not held to account for it. And the rules of engagement, we had one where there was a clique of 3 directors who were CEOs in their day job, and they essentially took over the running of the board. And because one of them was a lawyer, everyone tended to listen to this clique of 3. The other 2 were just nasty, and that absolutely almost destroyed the organisation until they had awareness from their colleagues of the behaviours that they were exhibiting and the rules of engagement. And the lead director in this little clique wrote to every director apologising because they had no idea that's how they were viewed.
That's amazing.
There's a comment Sarah made a comment about a dysfunctional relationship in the Q&A between chair and the executive. I think Steve's covered this. Short answer to that is it's not sustainable. I mean, there needs to be very strong relationship and trust. We've all been there. I mean, I've been on boards where that's a problem, and it permeates right down into the organisation, unfortunately. And so it has to change. It can't be sustained. There needs to be a very strong relationship and trust between board and chair if that board is to operate effectively.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris.
So just to close out the group dynamics and board cultures or board culture, as Steve said, take your values, if you have them, translate them into behaviors. That's a step that most often is missing. And then translate again into those rules of engagement. Can we call each other out on our BS and our blind spots that we don't realize that we have? Red flags, if there are red flags with your culture, with the group dynamics, there has to be swift movement around that. It's like when we're at work and there's that person that needs to be fired and doesn't get fired. And then finally, 8 months after all the problems start, they get fired. Everyone goes, why did you wait so long? Move swiftly. Otherwise, you're going to lose the good people. And you don't want to do that. Then we end up with a cycle of mediocrity.
Yeah.
And check in, is the sum of the board greater than its parts? So you have great people all together, make an even greater outcome. All right, let's jump forward for time. So in relation to sustaining, how do we keep that going? It first takes time and intention, not only to establish, but to maintain. Yeah, it might be a ton of work to get yourselves to where you want to be, but maintaining is obviously less onerous and burdensome, but it requires you to do things in the way you said you were going to, and that you've agreed to, and that you've set up your systems and processes and structures and pillars to make that happen. It just takes time. It just takes intention. You need to keep doing it, but also don't just set it and forget it. It's not something you can do once. We know how dynamic the business environment is, the governance requirements of directors and organizations always changing. So you need to have that time set aside to define and redefine your definition of effectiveness of your board. What does great look like now? Has it shifted? Do we need to change it? What do we need to tweak? Where do we need to flex and change and do differently because things have changed in our greater environment?
And Lisa, I think the question that many boards really don't reflect on, that they must, is why do we have a board in the first place? And the role of the board, very simply, when you strip everything away, the role of the board is to create the future. And everything else is a tool to help us get there. Strategy, risk, financial oversight, duty of care, duty of loyalty, duty of obedience. They're all tools to help us do what? Not to make sure the staff are busy, but to make sure that we're actually creating this outcome, this difference in the world that is future focused. And that's the gift of the board, not the fact that they meet 11 times a year.
Exactly. Yeah, that we're sustaining. And these pillars, they might feel to you to be a little rudimentary and entry level, and they could be, but are you actually doing something around it? Are you using a framework like this to make yourself more effective, more efficient? Only you and only your board can answer that question. So let's throw to some questions, Sean.
Yeah, there are some great questions here. On average, is there a benchmark of how many hours a board member uses to prepare for a board meeting? E.g., for every hour at the board table, the board member would spend how many X hours preparing?
Well, if you think of the Russell Reynolds data, it's 17 hours per hour of board meeting.
The most common statistic that's mentioned, Lisa, I think, is between absolute minimum 3 hours per hour, and usually on average about 7. And then you get the high performing ones, which actually want to really make a difference, and they put some serious intellect into it.
Yeah.
Next question. What is the context around the worst board event you have ever seen or experienced, and how could that have been avoided?
No comment.
Chris, I thought you had something to add there.
Look, there's been many. I think we've sort of covered a lot of board dynamics. I mean, you're dealing with personalities that are usually quite strong, and you know, you don't have the same luxury as day to day. You build strong relationships. You're coming together maybe 10 times a year, so you've got to work harder as a board. There's just a whole range of dynamics that make it challenging, and then you've got throw in there the pressure of, you know, what you've got to do. It's not an easy job. So I think there's many different challenges being a director on a board. So I'll probably just say that.
Question from Sarah Powell. What if there is conflict between board chair and executives, so decision-making and information sharing is restrictive, which impacts on the ability to manage the daily operational business?
Yeah, I sort of covered that earlier. I think it needs to change. It's not sustainable. And if information's not being shared, you know, if you get in trouble because there's a breach, you can't use that as an excuse. Oh, the board and the chair didn't get along. You know, the chair and the exec didn't get along. It's like you've got to make sure the board dynamic is constructive, and if it's not, change it.
Yeah.
One more question from Tamsin Coots. Do you have any tips for trying to engage the other board members on improvement of the board?
Beyond putting it on your board agenda and making them have the conversation, that's one way to force engagement. Or having a more informal conversation after the board meeting proper.
Yeah, look, it's a human element. I'll just share one example. Through COVID, one of the boards I was on, we found the conflict side of it was challenging. It wasn't until we actually came out of COVID that we got together over dinner and we all self-reflected and said, you know what, that was really hard, because that human interaction face-to-face and actually working on relationships outside of the board meeting structure is so important, right? Because you've got to develop that trust. Yeah. And if you don't do that, and if the only time you're ever talking to directors is in a pressure environment as a board, I'm afraid it can be challenging. So I would put time in outside of the board construct, the board meeting construct, to work on those relationships to ensure that there's a good level of trust.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have one more question.
I would just say, just be aware of those relationships. We had a board not that long ago where there were 3 dysfunctional directors. They were, in my terminology, feral. And one of them had a partner on staff who was feeding gossip up to this person, and then it was just blowing out. The board literally could not do its job.
Yeah.
You thought your issue was bad. That was a sucky one. That one.
Wow.
One final question before we finish off. Malcolm Fraser, do you think things like ESG will increase workload on board members pre-meetings?
Yep. I'm doing it now. I mean, it's important. Look, you know, you can go crazy on ESG. It is something that we all need to be thinking about. But yeah, look, it is increasing workload. Steve, you probably got another perspective on that.
Yeah, I would say that you should be doing it anyway. And the high-performing boards have always had ESG. They just never called it ESG. They were looking at the right things: stakeholder engagement, and what's our impact on society? What's our, the governance in all these different areas, the environment, what's our supply chain like? The high-performing boards have been doing this for decades and decades and decades, not because they had to, but because it was the right thing to do. Yep. So my view is, if you haven't been doing this, then yes, it's extra work. But it's worthwhile, not because you have to, but because it's the way of actually creating greater change in the world.
Yeah.
Thanks, Stephen. So thanks, everybody. This really almost concludes our session today. Feel free to connect with our presenters and our host on LinkedIn, as you can see on the screen here. I'm sure they will really look forward to your connection. Now, a little bit of a plug for our webinar schedule over the next 3 to 4 months. We have a schedule of webinars coming up, which you can learn all about these great governance topics at boardpro.com/webinars. Our next webinar on the 14th of September is titled How to Own Your Time in a Post-COVID World, led by Mike Burke from PEP Worldwide. And this is going to be a really interesting topic. So take a moment to consider an investment in time for this particular webinar. I'll look forward to hosting you back at these future events. Now, you'll receive an email from us very shortly after this, which will include a video of today's webinar, the presentation slides, and our topic white paper. So please feel free to share this information with your colleagues in business. We also post this collateral to our webinar page at boardpro.com/webinars over the next couple of days. Now, as you leave the webinar, don't forget to complete our 1-minute survey and go into the draw for our beautiful camper. We'll announce the winner shortly after the webinar today. Thanks again for your attendance. I really hope you enjoyed our session today. Thanks, Lisa, for your guidance today. Chris and Stephen, it was great to have you with us today. We'll see you all at our next webinar event, everybody.